All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our first Big Fish and Friends back. We're so glad to see you all out here. Thank you so much. We're very excited to welcome Lynea Wilson to speak about sponge hunters for all the way from the History of Diving Museum in Isla A few community announcements we've got. Woo!
Happy to be here.
A few community announcements we've got first. This Saturday, we've got our garden club at 10 a.m. So if you've got a green thumb, come and help us out. Lori Brooks will be leading that. So we'll be taking care of our garden area we were just in outside. We have our lionfish derby coming up for Earth Day. Team registration closes here pretty shortly. I think in about a week and a half or so. But fishing will be on Saturday, the 23rd, and we'll have our big weigh-in and celebration at Sharky's on Sunday, April 24th. Definitely stop by. The festival runs from 11 to 3. We'll be scoring all the fish. There will be lionfish tastings for free, drink specials, all the fun stuff that normally goes with our Lionfish Derby series. And we also have our Reef Race 5K that will be in June. So I know a lot of you all have already registered for that, but if you haven't, it's not too late. You get all sorts of cool stickers, an awesome rash guard with the 5K logo on it. So we would love to see you be a part of that. And without farther ado, here is Lynea Wilson and Sponge Hunters.
All right, thank you. I'm excited to be here. We're going to start with an easy win. We're going to start with an 18th century children's riddle, which is what's filled with holes but can still hold water. You guys are geniuses. You don't even need me for this. So this was a really common riddle in the 18th century. And they might have been thinking about sponges all the time, but you likely weren't. You probably haven't spent a lot of time in your life thinking about the sea sponge, also called the natural sponge. But it's had a really surprising impact on human history and culture. It has shaped whole regions of Florida and has motivated massive shifts in immigration. And it's really shaped the world at large. If you enjoy seeing junk performers at parades in the Keys, or if you like eating Greek food in West Florida, you can thank a sponge for both of those things, as well as so many other small, nuanced parts of our culture and life here. So my name is Lynea Wilson. I'm the museum curator at the History of Diving Museum in Isla. I'm guessing a lot of you have been there before, but if not, you definitely need to go, but maybe wait until May 18th or come twice. Because I have spent the last several months thinking about sponges more than most people here, because we're preparing a new exhibit called Sponge Hunters. And it's all about Key West hookers, Bahamian spongers, and the hard hat divers of Tarpon Springs. It's all about the sponge industry in this region at large. And tonight, I'm going to give you a really sweeping overview of it, just enough to make you so curious you have no choice. But we'll start with the sponge itself. I have a lot of fun props for you tonight, to include this sea sponge here. When you look at a natural sponge, what you're actually looking at is a skeleton. This is the skeleton of an aquatic animal that lives attached to rocks on the ocean's seafloor. So this is the dried skeleton. And when it was pulled from the ocean, it would have been filled with a glue-like substance called the gurry, and that's the living animal that lives inside of it. And it's incredibly slimy. One source from 1889 wrote, "They resemble heads of decayed cabbage." And I think they would have smelled about the same. This is many, many years before air conditioning is invented. So that's an important tidbit. And so many of the 1800 records refer to it as odoriferous, because sometimes the word smelly, it's just not enough. Odoriferous. And a lot of times these animals, they'd be plucked from the ocean floor and they begin decomposing on the boat. And that was part of the process that the industry used. And these spongers lived on these boats for months at a time with these decaying animals that were prized like gold. So you can imagine these are not pleasant experiences that they're in. All right, so this sponge in my hand definitely decomposed. No one's smelling me from over where you are. And it definitely has been cleaned some, but it's not been trimmed. You can see it's kind of an awkward shape. It looks like it could be a natural thing. And when I flip it over, you can see it's got these kind of darker spots, which are very velvety. I'm going to pass it around in a minute. You can see for yourself. And not only that, there's seashells that are embedded all within it. Because not only is this a living, breathing organism, it's also a habitat for a whole range of creatures, ranging from worms and mollusks to larger creatures like stone crabs and lobsters. And healthy habitat means healthy fisheries. So important today as it was then. A sponge of this size wouldn't be my first choice if I was a stone crab. But luckily, there are thousands of different types of sponges, and they range from all kinds of different types, from pillar sponges to vase sponges to wool sponges, like I have it here in my hands. And they appear in every color of the rainbow in waters all around the world. Thousands of species ranging from polar ice water to, of course, our tropical waters here. They even can appear in lakes sometimes, which is definitely a thing I did not know about sponges. And I'm gonna go ahead and pass this. So take one down, pass it around. So one of my favorite things about sponges is they have perfected the art of water filtration. Tropical sponges can remove up to over 90% of the bacteria in the water around them, and they can cycle through 20,000 times their own volume in a 24-hour period. So in the Caribbean, where sponges are abundant, they effectively clean the bacteria in the water surrounding the reef several times over per day. Oh, I missed a slide already. I'm also part of Toastmasters, which if you're not familiar, you should look it up. Toastmasters is an awesome tool, and I know for a fact that's going to get written down by one of my Toastmaster friends just here in the audience. No pressure. All right, but we're going to start this story 5,000 years ago. The recorded human use of sponges goes back that far, and the first people to really use it and record it were the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. Sponging was an important industry throughout the Mediterranean. It still is today, in fact, especially though in ancient Greece. The original Olympic Games actually included sponging to some extent because sponging was so important that free diving was an important skill to learn. And so free diving was part of the original Olympic Games. Yeah, Plato and Aristotle are among the many early Greek writers who mention sponges and sponging, and the industry is still very important in that region today. We have a map here of the Mediterranean. And so here's the Mediterranean Sea, and here's the Red Sea. And both of these were some of the most productive regions of sponging in the world throughout history. And we have Greece here, and they get most of the credit for early sponging, but absolutely we see sponging in Turkey. We hear references of it in Italy, but all of these places would have been using sponges. Today, the #1 producer of sponges in the world is Tunisia. So now the next question is why? Who cares? Why are we all obsessed with sponges? Less than 100 years ago, we didn't have mass-produced fabric. We didn't have synthetic sponges like we use for washing our car or ourselves or our dishes. We didn't have foam to stuff inside of comfy furniture. We didn't have tampons or produce contraceptives. We didn't have pillows. We didn't have chewing gum, and so many other things that will blow your mind. And for all of those things and so many more, we use sea sponges. Sea sponges that were plucked by hand by one person and then brought up to a boat and then went through a huge process to decompose and turn it into this beautiful little sponge. And then it came to the consumer. It's wild to think about today, and we'll talk about why that is later on. But this was a vital resource. It was used for manufacturing things. It was so important to the economies of, from 5,000 years ago with the Phoenicians and the Egyptians up to the 19th, 20th century. So like the mid-1900s, so we're still using this. Your grandparents might have had a prized sea sponge for one job or another. Also, you are seeing toilet paper. The ancient Egyptians had an invention called the tessorium, which loosely translates to sponge on a stick. Don't overthink it. All right. So most of the sea sponges you've seen probably looked relatively like the one that's being passed around. And that's because that is a commercial sponge. Of the thousands of species there's only 5 that are really predominantly used, at least by people in our region historically. And those commercial sponges, which are so heavily prized, are only found in very few places in the world, to include the Mediterranean Sea, which we already talked about, as well as this very blurry map from 1805. Troubleshoot that later. But here we are, way over here. And this region is where almost all of the commercial sponges in the world are found outside of the Mediterranean. And these commercial, the 5 species which are found, you can see them listed here. The one that's being passed around is a wool sponge, also called a sheep's head sponge, and that was El Primo. That is the number one thing that spongers in this area were looking for. But there was also yellow, grass, finger, and wire sponges, all which serve kind of different purposes for different industries. And these are the places where they're found. We've got Mediterranean, you guys are pros. And then southern Florida starts in Key West. Western Florida, Tarpon Springs, we will get to that. And the Bahamian archipelago, where it really begins. All right, so there's 4 methods truly for sponge diving, but there's 3 that we're going to talk about, the 3 most common. The first would have been freediving. And that is true for most of diving history. It doesn't take any special equipment. And in shallow water, it's as effective a method of fishing that doesn't require a startup cost. If anyone in this room has ever bought dive gear and had that affect their budget for the month, you understand the appeals of freediving. But it has limitations, and we see it overtaken by hooking. And hooking was the most prominent method of sponging. We see it happening very many places in the world. But spongers using this method, they were called hookers because of the hooks they used. And I have a version of it here, but hookers that were truly hooking, the most famous, they were using hooks attached to very long poles. And this beautiful illustration made by my coworker, Julia, it shows it really well. Hooking happened in 2-man teams. Always, 19th century hook boats always had an odd number of crew, and that's because spongers worked in pairs and the cook worked alone. There was always one cook on the vessel. Each pair was made up of a hooker here in the front and a sculler in the back, and they communicated in a wide variety of ways, but the hooker is spending their whole time crunched over the boat using a sponge glass or a water bucket or a look glass. There's a million names they call these, but it's a simple invention. This is a reproduction, a little more elegant than what they would have been using in the 19th century. It would have been essentially a wooden bucket with the bottom kicked out, replaced by a piece of glass. And so they use it, and you still see them today, actually. It's similar to a glass bottom boat, essentially. They're using it to look beyond the surface of the water to see underneath. Less common, but I think more interesting, 1800s Key West spongers, they would also sometimes sprinkle oil extracted from nurse shark livers, and it would calm the surface of the water to be able to see below. This is much less common, but it's so weird. Had to share. So once the hooker spots a viable sponge, he's going to submerge his long hook into the water and remove the sponge from its bed, pluck it up, bring it back to the boat. So I want you to think about, if you're a boater, think about the worst anchor you've ever pulled. And imagine that's just your whole job. That's the whole game. You're up there and you're just pulling things up, and you're going to do that until the boat is full, and then you're going to go to we'll get to that. We'll get to a larger boat, and you're just doing that for a month at a time. And then you go home and you smell terrible, and no one wants to be around you. This is really not an easy job. I'm making jokes, but you're also in the heat of the sun, either in Bahamas or Florida. You have sunscreen, I assume, is not invented. And you're crowded over that boat. If you've ever slept wrong and woken up the next day, imagine your job is to be a sponger. Way worse. And then the last method, of course, is the easiest to some extent, and that's hard hat diving. And that's not introduced till much later in the game. I have a fabricated fiberglass helmet here. You're welcome to put on. Just keep in mind, after the talk, don't rush me. But know that it weighs a mere fraction of what a standard diving dress weighs. And diving for sponges, it's by far the most effective method, which is good and bad. But it also has a much higher cost of entry. You have to have a standard diving suit. And it requires skilled divers that know what they're doing and are going to be a boon to the industry. It also comes with greater risk, as I think a lot of you are probably divers here, you know. Oh, jumped the gun. At some point, all of the different sponging methods you see here were used by all of the 3 different sponging operations we're going to talk about. It'd be much easier if I could tidily say Bahamas, Key West, Tarpon Springs, but it's not quite as simple as that because history is not as simple as that. We have lots of overlap. We have lots of people moving from one area to another and people learning from each other and improving. And also, what is interesting is the different areas have extreme loyalties to a certain method. Key West especially is hooking forever, hooking until they will not do anything else. They actually go out of their way to try to make other methods illegal. And we'll get into a very juicy drama story about Key Westers, But for now, just know we're going to see all these different methods. But the story of the sponge trade in our hemisphere, it really begins in the Bahamas. Locals were likely using sponges long before discovery. Discovery, anytime you see it in a history book, question that. Likely sponges were washing up on shore and they were free diving for them to some extent, I'm sure. But there wasn't a Western organized sponge industry until a Frenchman shipwrecked in the islands in 1841. His name was Gustave Renoir. I'm not standing in front of it. And when he was there, he sees this abundance of sponges, and he's from France. He was close to Greece. There would have definitely been sponges in his life. He sees essentially gold laying in the dirt, and he brings 500 to 600 different specimens back to France with him, where he is able to easily sell them for a far higher price because they are a quality that is unseen in the Mediterranean at this era. Because keep in mind, they've been fishing there for thousands of years. This is a new, untapped market. So Renoir quickly arranges for more Bahamian sponges to be sent to the European markets, and this small-scale production grows very rapidly. It grows into one of the most profitable sponge industries in the world, and the first shipment trial, that's 1841, right? And for the next 100 years, the Bahamians and Key West, they dominate the sponge market. And this trade eventually encompasses Florida, Jamaica, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Mexico, although the Bahamas and Florida are always going to be your top producers of sponges. At the height of the sponge trade in the Bahamas, most schooners were built for this purpose. A typical vessel was about 50 feet long, and on its decks, you have stacks of two-man dinghies. So it's just one big boat with lots of other smaller boats, and they're going out for extended amounts of time. There was sponging done. Oh, gosh, look at that map. Oh, all right, this orb, fluffy orb, is Florida. This fluffy orb is the Bahamas. Oh, tough. I think Cuba. All right. So
it needs some nurse shark liver oil.
It needs nurse shark liver oil. What a hero. So sponging is done in this central orb, which is a bay, and it's called the Muds. But there's a lot of sponging done off of the Abacos, Long Island, and Exuma. But the main sponging grounds were called the Mud. And this was on Great Bahama Bank, west of Anchois Islands. What a map. Prior to 1939, these were considered the most productive sponge grounds in the world. Hookers went out in dinghies, they filled them with their sponges, and then they returned to the main vessel every day. So then the sponges dried out on ship. We've talked about what that smelled like, you guys know. The fishermen then make for shore, where they either buried sponges to decompose, or they built an enclosed pen of sticks called a crawl. And we're going to hear more about crawls, so remember that term. To speed the removal of the decaying matter, because this is a process they're going through. It's about a week now that we're at. After about a week, they dig them up or they remove them from the crawls and they beat them with sticks for more decaying matter to fall out. And then they pick out any coral, sand, rocks that's stuck in there. And then the mass of sponges, and I'm talking very literal mass of sponges, is taken to Nassau, which is where this sponge market is. And from there, it's going to be sold to to merchants at the market. And I mean, massive sponges. A single vessel might return with between 5,000 and 15,000 sponges from 1 month-long voyage. And when they have cleaned and trimmed in the warehouse, the sponges are then taken to the packing yard for yet another layer of this process. And there they're going to be laid out in the sun to dry. They're going to be sorted by quality. And then a mechanical press is used to squeeze sponges into burlap bales. And close to 1,000 bales could be pressed into close to 1,000 sponges could be pressed into a single bale. Which, if you're taking it all the way to France from the Bahamas, that's a good thing.
Still heavy.
It's real heavy. Those are not fast-moving ships. All right, we have learned some things. All right. So now our sponges are processed, right? We've gotten through it, and they are ready to be exported. And buyers include some Nassau merchants, but predominantly Europeans. And they represent larger foreign markets. And this system creates immense wealth if you are on the tippy top, if you are a European or Nassau merchant. But for the most part, the people doing the actual labor were largely people who had been enslaved. And this is a really important dynamic that we go to at length in the exhibits, but I got 45 minutes. So the short version is the Bahamian Islands were used to intercept ships that were carrying enslaved people when the British slave trade was abolished in 1807. So nearly 7,000 Africans were freed in this effort, and they were resettled without choice in the Bahamas. By 1834, slavery was abolished through the British Empire, and then about 30 years later in the United States. And you need to have this framework in mind to understand that the Bahamian sponger lived in virtual poverty. And we've discussed this is not a good job. This is a very, very difficult job in an extremely lucrative field. They had few options in terms of leaving for better opportunity, and instead of wages, spongers got a share of the profits. But they were essentially forced to borrow in advance on those profits, which created a vicious debt cycle. So it keeps people where they are. But despite this, by 1917, the Bahamian sponging industry is flourishing. They are on their game. Europe was now 3 years into World War I, which is terrible, but for them it gets even better because it means the Mediterranean sponge trade is halted, like done. Like they're paused for a moment. They're busy thinking about other things. About 27% of all of the sponges in the world at this point, all of the sponges produced that year came from the Bahamas. And it employed about 6,000 men and women, nearly a third of the working population of the Bahamas. And then the start of World War II requires more sponges than ever to be used, because sponges are used for weird things that we can't even comprehend. For example, cleaning and manufacturing of tanks and other weapons. So just as this need is exploding, the Bahamas gets hit by a blight. And blights are very interesting to read about in the historical record. They come every few years, very mysteriously. They kill off lots of fish. People don't understand why it's happening, and then it goes away. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Maybe a little bit like red tide? Right. So they get hit with a really brutal blight, though, and it wipes out the population of the Bahamian sponge beds. And there's strong beliefs. They think it's going to come back, it's going to rebound, but it's World War II. They need sponges. They don't have time to wait for this population to rebound. So instead, the synthetic sponge is invented in 1940. And we're going to come back to that because that's the whole thing. So one response to this, though, is the world is also looking a little better. Slavery is now abolished in all the places that they might want to go. And we're seeing intense migration to the United States, especially to Key West. All right, this is a very sad end. So I'm going to give you a quick spoiler alert about the exhibit and tell you that sponges, one really cool thing about them is they're renewable. So there's now a huge resurgence of sponging in the Bahamas, and there's a lot of different cultivation programs that are out there, to include in our waters here. And one thing that we did for this exhibit is that we have a number of scientists that we partnered with. And one of them, specifically the work she does outplanting projects, growing and cultivating sponges, and then cultivating them. And if that is a cool thing that you would like to do, be sure to follow our newsletter so that you can find out when we're going to be doing these opportunities. We're looking at least once a month, but potentially more than that. So if you want to go out and dive to be part of the sponge solution, be sure to connect with us. All right, but from here, like so many conchs, we are moving to Key West. All right, and I use that term intentionally to see how you all reacted because any 21st century Key West local or Keys local could tell you that a conch is someone who's born in the Keys, specifically, typically to Keys' parents. But in the 1800s, that term actually meant that you were a Bahamian in the Keys, specifically a Bahamian in Key West, specifically, most likely, a white Bahamian in Key West. And there was a long history of exchange between the Bahamas and the Key West, certainly. They're not that far away. And a lot of them came for all the things that were happening in Key West that were making people money. So wrecking, catching turtles, fishing, and for sure, sponging. There's a long history in the 1700s, and as rules about slavery start to change, we see even more migration. But even before then, in 1821, Key West becomes a U.S. territory. The city is quickly established, And just like in the Bahamas, Key West residents would have been making use of natural sponges. They know what it is. They see it and they're free diving for it, most likely. But in the first century of Key West history, they want to prove that they are an American city, that they are a worthwhile part of this nation. And part of the way they do that is they want to connect their port to the rest of the nation with really valuable, productive commodities that are marketable on the mainland. So Key West gradually becomes well known as a seaport, and it is defined by its reliance on its ocean environment. So I have some really fun quotes that we're going to read that I think they just illustrate how well they did this. Everything is coral here, or rather, everything is based on coral. The keys, the sponges, the harbors, the reef, and the wrecking business. The wreckers are bred to the sea. This is my favorite quote. What they don't know about fishing, turtling, and egging isn't worth knowing. By the mid-1840s, sponges are a prized part of the Key West industry. But the number one is still wrecking. If you don't know, what wreckers did was they would watch the reef line, they would watch shipwrecks happen, and then they would go save those people and sell their own cargo back to them. This sounds so smarmy in our time period, but that's really valuable. If your cargo is tons and tons of spices that you're going to sell for a pretty penny in England, even if you have to buy it back from people who just rescued you for 30%, you're going to do that. That's still very valuable. And that is how the city of Key West was born. It was an extremely lucrative affair, but it was one of 4 main maritime industries. And to tell you how valuable it was, by 1860, Key West established 1821, right? By 1860, it is the most wealthy city in America. Wrecking is the most well-known function of this, but as improved map making and technology improved, so we had lighthouses, there was less wrecking. It's terrible, sad to hear. And so other industries like fishing, turtling, and sponging become much more prominent and important. The Civil War dramatically decreases wrecking opportunities because boats are scared to go through, fair enough. And the wreckers, more and more wreckers are pushed into this new trade, which is the sponge trade. I won't elaborate too much on the techniques of hooking and processing sponges in Key West because it's very similar to the Bahamas because we have a lot of Bahamian migration happening. So a lot of the sponges in Key West are Bahamian. One difference, though, is the pay scale. It's still a similar system. It's kind of like sharecropping in some ways, where you're indebted to this person that owns the boat, but it's a lot more equitable and it's a lot more lucrative. So the average sponge fisherman in Key West was making about $500 a year, which was more than double the annual income of anyone working in Florida's manufacturing processes. So Key West is now starting to dominate the sponge industry. And from its official start in the 1820s through the early 1900s, that remains true. But there are signs that the sponge beds are depleted as early as 1860. And so what do you do when your resources begin to show signs of depletion? You venture out. You look for more and more deeper, better options to find these golden sponges. But even that was not enough. By the 1880s, spongers report seeing decline in sponges, both the number and the quality, even as waters deep as 40 or 50 feet. Off Key West, what they started in, less than a decade before, 10 to 15 feet of water. If you think you've got a giant pole and the different forces at work, the currents, it's a lot easier to sponge in 10 feet than it is in 50 feet. But even 50 feet was not enough. So they're now moving even further outside of their waters to new parts of Florida, new to them parts of Florida. And in the early 1870s, new sponge grounds are discovered in the Gulf of Mexico. Do we trust the word discovered in history? No. So these waters are near Tarpon Springs. And we'll pause in Key West here. We're going to travel to the homesteads in newly developing cities near these sponge beds. Because discovered, not a word we trust. But it is genuinely what is recorded in Key West records of the time. but it's not ideal. So there are a small number of boats that are working in these areas, but it's largely homesteads, because that's how Florida was founded, was a lot of different homesteads living crazy lives, very different from ours, like eating squirrels, covered in mosquitoes at all times. The area is fished by spongers from Tarpon Springs, Apalachicola, St. Mark's, Cedar Key, and other small groups of these homesteaders, but for about three decades. So not a lot of people, and not for that long a time in the context of history, but they were there and they were established. So now we have Tarpon Springs hookers, and they're working these sponge beds. And suddenly this much larger and well-known Key West operation is making the trek to get there as well. And the distance back to Key West, it's not that practical. It's a long way for them. So they have to start processing in Tarpon Springs. They're burying their sponges on their shores or on their sandbars, or they're building crawls on their shores or on their sandbars. Tarpon Springs doesn't like this very much, but they also have no power. So what are they going to do? But to counter the trend, they slowly developed their own markets, and they increased their numbers of sponge boats. And by 1887, Tarpon Springs spongers, they have a New York dealer. They're kind of hot. And in 1995, they're not that hot. So just 5% of Florida sponges come from Tarpon Springs that year. But they also have something that Key West doesn't. They have an easy train line, which you've probably heard. 1935 hurricane, the train to Key West, so much drama. It's not easy, right? These spongers in Tarpon Springs, that's a big leg up. So Key West is very nervous by this. And added to this, there's now another war. The fear of Spanish vessels during the Spanish-American War drives even more Key West fishermen to land their catch in Tarpon Springs, and soon this very small settlement becomes a very real rival to Key West. And the two Florida regions using the same method and these same sponge beds to go after the same resource, it becomes an issue. All right, and this is where a very intense rivalry begins. Things get juicy. By 1890, Tarpon Springs has become a significant sponge market, and their growth attracts interest. It attracts settlers, especially Greek men from the Mediterranean, because they know about sponges. And they move from Greece, and they're motivated by the prospect of new sponge beds, because again, Mediterranean sponge beds, they've been at them for thousands of years. Yes, sponges regenerate, but not that fast. So with them, they bring knowledge of a very different method of sponging. Like we said, diving is a lot more effective. So on June 18th, 1905, a diver is lowered overboard and walks for the first time on the sponge beds of the Gulf of Mexico, trailing little oxygen bubbles and carrying a short rake, which I have right here. Carrying a rake like this, he's able to get more sponges in that dive than the average sponge boat gets for its full day. Actually, we can pass this around too. It's hardy. So to the spongers in smaller hook boats, this would have been terrifying. For the Key West hookers especially, this is a lose-lose situation. They are the furthest from home they have ever been forced to go, and now Tarpon Springs spongers have easier methods for processing and selling their catch. And over here, this is a crawl that I was talking about. See, they've planted these sticks and they're keeping them in this spot. The first months of sponge diving in Florida, you can't be too good. They actually crashed the market. The supply of sponges from the Gulf expands so rapidly that sponges that were worth $8 to $10 in the opening weeks of 1906, they're now selling for $3 in May. And this intensive fishing lowered prices. It increased competition, and it stimulates even more intensive fishing then. So the Greek spongers, they revolutionized this industry, and they do eventually flatten out the market, but they also completely moved the capital of sponging in America very easily from Key West to Tarpon Springs. And that actually remains true even after the sponges were no longer the prime catch. This cutthroat competition, together with a heavily declining yield from the overworked sponge beds, it quickly forces boat-based spongers out of the industry and into other things. Between 1900 and 1908, that's only 8 years, the number of men in the Key West sponging industry declines by more than 50%. And keep in mind, this has been almost 100 years of this industry. This led to immense conflict, the high seas drama I spoke of, right? These two groups of fishermen, this drama characterizes the entire era of sponge history. It spawns songs and movies. If you'd like to watch a weird movie, I'll talk to you after. But Key Westers, they try to lobby to make it illegal to dive on boats. It works, but it isn't enforced. And so then they start new things. And then boats are set on fire. Oh, it could be worse. Our boat could be set on fire with people in it. They have to hire watchmen for their crawls because people are climbing in and stealing their kedges at night, which means if you're a sponger, you're now having to pay part of your share for this boat for a watchman to watch your sponges while you sleep in your stinky boat. Right. So this really, the Key West spongers, they disappear just like the commercial sponge beds in the Keys. And it seems to me like a researcher, like it happens so fast. But I spoke to the curator at the Custom House in Key West, and it makes sense because all of these spongers from Key West, at one point in time, they would have also been wreckers. And if the weather was bad or the conditions were whatever, they also would have been going for turtles, or they would have been going for fish, because all of these maritime industries that built Key West, they played on each other. So even though they fought so hard to stay so relevant as the sponge kings of America, they also knew when to cut their losses, right? And at this point in Key West history, cigar making is also becoming a key industry, and manufacturing jobs are starting to increase. And these are things with a little bit more stability, and that certainly is going to appeal to fishermen that are probably a little bit exhausted from all the boats being set on fire. But even then, in some regards, this makes Tarpon Springs the victor of this rivalry, right? But the reality is the world is quickly changing. The health of the sponge beds in Key West were done. And then in 1938, we first see the fungal bloom in the Bahamas, and it quickly comes for Tarpon Springs as well. They're hit very hard by this fungal infection, and just like in the Bahamas, there was this intense need for sponges for World War II to fight the war effort. Well, the war effort also required other things. It required people. People to be in the fight or to be producing goods that were needed for the fight. And if they couldn't produce sponges, they needed to produce something else. It means there would have been an intense need for manufacturing jobs, things which, again, would have been much more stable than what the spongers had been experiencing. World War II also led to an intense innovation out of sheer need. I think I missed a slide. Yes, I think I missed a whole page. I'm sorry, guys. So talking about why this industry is declining now, right? So we're seeing the blights and the red tide in Tarpon Springs in the Bahamas. We're seeing economic insecurity as the war is shaking up the entirety of the economy. And we're seeing a changing market. The war effort means they need different resources to be produced. And those are resources that might provide more stability or they might not. But sponges are out. They're not working the way they have been for hundreds of years. And one of the weirdest parts of this, if we look at this slide again, more than half of what you're seeing here was invented in the 1940s. And that is not a coincidence, because human ingenuity had us use the sponge for all of these purposes. And that made the sponge invaluable and created the need for the entire history, which you just absorbed. And then over 100 years, human invention lessened our need for the animal at all, to the point that it's hard to even talk about why the sponge was so important because it's so out of our minds. So you've now seen a very wide expanse of culture and history going back thousands of years, all through this porous lens of the sea sponge, right? And history through a specific lens can be so interesting. And the very best place in the Florida Keys that you can see that in action is the History of Diving Museum. So diving impacts so many aspects of our lives, whether you're in the Florida Keys or landlocked Kansas. And if you'd like to learn even more about the sponge and all of its gifts, be sure to come and see the new exhibit. It opens May 18th. It's called Sponge Hunters. And I promise there's still so much to this story that I haven't even touched on. It's a really fascinating, nuanced history that affects so many aspects of even modern day life.
Very absorbing.
Very absorbing. Good. Good. I'm so glad. Not full of holes. And so, yeah, thank you for your attention. I'd love to open the questions. Oh, so full life form.
We're gonna
I will
questions into here so
repeat
that
that.
way our online listeners can hear.
Perfect. I'm gonna.
I asked the sponge that you passed around, what does it look like before it is dead in full life form?
Oh, I have. So, okay, here's a painting. It's a lot darker in color. That's the biggest distinction. That some of them are almost black, especially the wool sponges, and they're very, very slimy. They're filled with what's called gurry, which is the living animal inside of it, and very, very sticky and slimy, and very dark in color.
Just trying to identify if I've seen one.
Well, you've definitely seen sponges on the reef because they're maybe not the commercial kind that you might get as a Christmas gift, but you've definitely seen sponges. If you're ever on a reef snorkeling or diving, a lot of the brightest colors are from the sponges.
Are they filter feeders?
I don't know that they're filter feeders. That was the question.
How do they feed?
Yes, I believe they are filter feeders. Yes, because filtration is a big part of the just living embodiment of the sponge. They're constantly pulling things in. It's actually really incredible in some shallow waters when you can see the top of the water over the sponge. It almost looks like it's boiling because of the constant movement of the sponge sucking water into it.
What it makes a non-commercial sponge and a commercial sponge? What it makes it?
That is a great question. So the question was, what's the difference between a commercial sponge and a non-commercial sponge? Essentially, uniformity, that they are relatively the same size. They're dense. They're easily retrieved from the ocean. They're going to be a round shape instead of like a vase sponge, which is going to have, a giant hole in the middle like a vase. I think also the texture of it, like the nap almost, if you think about it, is going to be tighter on a commercial sponge than a non-commercial. There's probably many, many other distinctions because there are thousands of species of corals and only really 5 that we went after as commercials. But essentially the ones that look more or less like this. It's like that one, that looks good.
So the question is, the sponges that were in the Mediterranean, and how different are they than the sponges that are in the Florida region?
Ooh, okay.
Because it's like a angelfish. There's a king angelfish in the Pacific and a queen angel over here. So are the same or different?
That's a very interesting question. So what are the differences between sponges in the Mediterranean versus in our regions here in Florida waters? And a specific reference to different like angelfish, which you see here in other places. I can't say specifically because I haven't done that. Although if my boss wanted to pay for me to do that, this is my boss. That would be cool. But we definitely see the same species. Wool sponge is one of the #1 top sponges in the Mediterranean. But there are several others. Like there was a velvet sponge, which was briefly seen in the Caribbean, but seemed to go extinct relatively quickly. And I did see references of the velvet sponge in the Mediterranean. It's also likely they would have had different names. Because today, it's very easy to say, well, this is an angelfish, because that's what they're calling it in the Pacific. We have a lot less communication happening in the 1800s, across long ways. So it's hard for me to say with expertise the difference there, but I know the wool sponge was king all over the world. Oh, so many hands. Do you want to go first, David?
Yeah. What does our sponge field look like in the Keys right now?
So there is still sponging that happens all over the world, and that's true in the Keys. There's some groups in Sugarloaf that are doing sponging with traditional methods, which is pretty cool. There's definitely sponging, like I said, in Tunisia, other places in the Mediterranean. Another cool thing, even when the Key West sponge beds were so depleted of commercial sponges, there wasn't a huge environmental impact because they weren't going for any of the non-commercial sponges. So there was still hundreds, maybe even thousands of species of sponges, just not the ones they wanted. Today, obviously, climate change, the world is a little different. Certainly our underwater world is different. I imagine it's not as good as it was then, but there's a lot of restoration being done, specifically in the Keys. I know FWC has a massive restoration effort they're doing, as does Bobby Renfro, who's the scientist that we've partnered with for this exhibit. And she's doing really cool work, so you can be a part of it.
You said there was a 4th method.
There is a fourth method, but it was made illegal like almost everywhere almost immediately. So I didn't do a ton of research into it. It's essentially dredging, which we all know. Apparently, even in the 1800s, they were like, this is a bad idea. Real bad. They called it something different, but I saw pictures. So I was like, oh yeah, that's everyone knows, bad idea. And yet we do it.
You may have touched upon this before. I walked in, so I won't remember later. But you mentioned Gurry are the living animals that are included in sponges. What type of animal is it? Is it like a zooplankton or like a and is it similar to the symbiosis that coral have with those jellies?
All right, so I'll repeat the question. It was a very specific science question. The answer is I'm a museum curator, which means my job is not to know the things, it's to find the people that know the things and have them inform me. I do not know. Oh, Julia can answer that.
So my degree is in biology.
Oh, nailed it. See, look at that. I already found someone for you.
So the sponge is actually its own animal. So it's its own order of animal. It's called Porifera. Yeah. Very fitting name. So it is its own animal. It's not like a different species. It's not plankton. It is the sponge.
I did read that. Yeah, I should have known that one. Thank you, Julie. All right. Actually, someone just said the gurry is the sponge, and that's a good point. I'm just holding the skeleton. So this is what is useful to me as a human and an observer of human history, but the actual animal is the sponge with the gurry inside. That's a good thing to remember. I don't know who said that, but yeah, A+.
Kind of like taking all the meat off your skeleton.
Fair enough, yeah.
How long does the skeleton, the sponge we use last? Why does it last?
Oh, it actually can last a very, oh, sorry. The question was, how long does the skeleton of the animal, the sponge that we use, last? That's a great question. And part of why it was so prized, forever. I mean, if you take care of the sponge, it lasts an unbelievably long time. It's antibacterial, it's like hypoallergenic. It is an incredible resource, and it does last a very, very long time. Even in ancient Roman times when they were all sharing sponge on a stick.
So with today's, renewable resources and trying to get away from some of these plastics and that kind of stuff, does the sponge have a second life?
Yes. The question was, paraphrasing, is the sponge having a resurgence because we're so interested in natural resources now and things that are renewable? Absolutely. The number one example that comes to mind is in place of tampons. It's actually become a huge thing, is you can get natural sea sponges that you can reuse. But there's many other better examples than that. That's just the one that's up top. So there we are.
Are you selling that at the museum?
Maybe we should. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to repeat that question for the live stream. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other questions while you're here? Well, thank you guys so much for being such an involved audience.
Lynea, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Here's our certificate
Thank
for
you.
you. Thank you so much.
Oh, this is cool.
Thank you all for coming as well. We really appreciate you all. You really are a part of the Reef family, and we're so glad to start Fish and Friends back up again. Next month, we have Dr. Emily Schmidt, who's coming down from Nova. She was one of the people who helped found Reef, and we're really excited to see her down. So we'll hope to see you, as always, second Tuesday of the month. We'll start at about 6:15, talks at 7.
And if I may, speaking of recurring lecture series, so the History of Diving Museum, where I work, we also have a lecture series we do once a month. It's every third Wednesday. So you remember every second Tuesday, every third Wednesday, and probably other fun things once a month too. The next speaker is me, so I won't be offended if you don't come. But we have so many fun lectures lined up for the rest of the year and starting in next year, to include one of your Reef members, Barbara, who's going to be talking about a very cool project we have going through cataloged skin diver magazines starting in the early 1950s. So check out our newsletter for that as well.
All right. Thank you all so much.